Hey everybody, good to have you guys back for another edition of Intuitive Angling. Much appreciated you taking a little time out of your day to watch the video. And you guys know we've been talking the last week quite a bit about jigs since we launched the Block It Old School jig here. And I'm going to continue going over a little bit more jig tips, jig advice, leading up into late winter and early spring when jig fishing really kicks in. Today what we're going to talk about is I hear a lot of anglers say all the time, it's like, I just can't seem to get bites on a jig very much. It's like they struggle getting fish to bite a jig versus like a Texas rig or shaky head or something like that. I hear that common thread a lot. So I'm going to give you guys some tips and advice on why you may not be getting many bites on a jig and sort of what you can do to increase your odds and definitely step up your jig fishing game. So anyway, guys, if y'all are interested, we talked about in the Block It Old School jigs. You can get them at Baitworks here in Springfield, Missouri, online. I'll include the link in the description, and you can order them straight through that link. It's a great way to support the channel here if you guys want to help out what we're doing here. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit, guys. I hear this all the time. I'll get comments all the time. It's like, I just can't get many bites on jigs. I just struggle jig fishing. A lot of this has to do with a wide range of different circumstances and situation. It has to do with the type of jig you're fishing, has to do with the color of the jig you're fishing, and it has to do with the trailer that you're using on the jig and knowing when to throw it and when not to throw it. First of all, they'll bite a jig 12 months out of the year. I've never in my entire life been to a lake where they wouldn't bite a jig. Sometimes it's a football head jig, sometimes it's a finesse jig, sometimes it's a pitching and flipping jig, sometimes it's a casting jig. They'll bite it anywhere. I mean, literally, if you're fishing in 3 inches of visibility or 50 foot of visibility, they will bite a jig. So a lot of it has to do with the type of water that you're fishing, the body of water that you're fishing. Because, for example, like in Florida, if you fish down there a lot, about the only thing they do down there is fish heavy black and blue jigs. If you fish in my part of the country, here in Missouri, Oklahoma, we use a wide range of jigs, football heads, finesse jigs, flipping jigs, everything. And if you fish maybe in eastern Tennessee, it's more of a finesse jig deal. So a lot of it depends on regionally where you're fishing, what the bass prefer. And what the bass prefer in jigs has a lot to do with the species of bass you're fishing. If you have a lake that has a mixed species, largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass, it can be a little bit different than like a straight largemouth lake. The water visibility has a lot to do with it. The type of cover has a lot to do with the time of year. So I'm going to give you guys some general foundational tips that'll help you get more bites on the jig. Now, I know there are specifics, and we're going to do a lot of different videos down the line, but today I want to lay some groundwork as far as what you need to do to get bites in a variety of situations. So let's talk about, first of all, let's talk about one of the prime jig fishing conditions, flooded cover. I love fishing a jig in any type of flooded cover. If the lakes you're fishing high and it doesn't matter if you got flooded bushes, flooded willow trees, flooded whatever type of trees, mesquite trees, flooded grass, hayfield grass, water willows, anything like that. Anytime you have flooded cover, that's when you want to use a pitching and flipping jig, sort of like the 5/8 ounce model jig we make here. Most of the time, if you're flipping and pitching in the thicker cover, you want to use a little bit heavier jig to penetrate that cover, getting it down into the cover as well. The next thing a lot of people have struggled with as far as getting bites, say in a flooded cover situation, is the color. The color of the jig that you're using has a lot to do with the water clarity that you're fishing. In general, if I'm fishing water visibilities that have less than, say, 1.5 feet of visibility, I'm using a darker jig, like a black and blue, black and chartreuse, solid black, something like that. And if the water visibility is over, say, 2 foot, two and even greater like that, I'm usually using some type of a brown, some type of a green pumpkin, something, that's not quite as, throws off much of a silhouette. So that's the first reason a lot of people don't get bites on a jig a lot of time, is they're using the wrong color. The next situation is the trailer that you're using. If you're fishing a lake that's got a lot of heavy cover, that's a lot of times I'll go to a little bit bigger trailer, a little bit bulkier profile jig, or bulkier profile trailer with my jig, because a lot of times that will get you more bites. And then you have to make the determination of whether you're using it like a frog type trailer or one of those trailers like a rage craw or a zoom speed craw that has the flapping tails. A lot of that has to do with the personality of the fish. You'll find that in general, the warmer the water, the more they want a flapping tail, and the colder the water, the more they want a tail that doesn't flap. Next, let's talk about a situation, just a typical jig fishing situation. And this can be water visibility anywhere between 2 foot or greater. It can be fishing boat docks. It can be fishing bluff banks. It can be fishing rocks. It can be fishing, lay down trees in the water, anything like that. Under those situations, that's when I usually like a smaller finesse type jig. If I'm not fishing the super, super thick cover, I like a little bit downsized jig. And a lot of times this is just, it's a smaller profile, something like this with a smaller trailer on it. Again, with the same guidelines as far as the water clarity dictating the color of the jig you're fishing and the type of trailer you're fishing. But in general, you'll find out if you are fishing sparser cover or cover that has edges to it, like a stump that has the edge to it, or maybe like a lay down tree, a log grown into the water that's not thick cover, but it's a piece of cover, or a boat dock piling, something like that. They like a smaller jig. A lot of people, one of the reasons they don't catch fish on jigs is they're using jigs that are a little bit too heavy for that situation. And so that's going to, and we can get into swim jigs and football head jigs and everything. That's another video completely there. Most of the time, again, we'll talk a little bit about football head jigs real quick. If you feel that the bass are in 5 to 20 foot of water and you're getting bites on a shaky head or something like that, a lot of times you can go to a football head jig and generate bigger bites, not as many of them, but bigger bites with that. Okay, that's just a general foundation as far as jig colors, sizes, when to use them, and that type of stuff. Another reason about a lot of guys struggle with getting bites on jigs is they don't know how to work them as good. In general, unless you're fishing a football head jig, if you're fishing a flipping jig or a finesse jig or casting jig, you need to hop the bait harder than you would a Texas rig worm. A lot of times on a Texas rig, you'll throw it out there and you'll just sort of, drag it through the bottom, work it, drag it like that. When you're fishing a jig, you need to throw it out there, let it hit the bottom, and pop it off the bottom. Let it slack hit the bottom, pop it off the bottom. Try to pop your jig 6 inches to a foot off the bottom when you retrieve it. That creates a reaction strike that is not the same with some type of a Texas rig. And I think one of the biggest reasons people don't get as many bites on jigs is they fish the bait too slow. One of my mentors I talked about before, Terry Thomas, he always taught me about the big fish hop on a jig. And that's when he hopped it high off the bottom. And that's when you get a lot of bites with the jig. So that has a big factor on it. The next variable, why a lot of people don't catch them on jigs, and it goes on, is they're using the wrong size as far as the weight goes on it. The weight of your jig has a lot to do with getting bites on a jig, because a lot of it has to do with whether the fish are hitting the jig out of reaction or feeding. In general here, we'll talk about weight a little bit. The warmer and the clearer the water, the heavier the jig you need to use. So if you're fishing water that's over 3 foot visibility and pretty clear, you tend to go with a heavier jig. And as that water clarity deteriorates down into like 6 inches, 4 inches, that's when I go to a lighter jig. And there's also a variable of water temperature in there too, because as the gradient decreases in water visibility and water temperature, that's also when you use lighter jigs. Another reason that they're not getting bites on jigs is in relationship to how fast your jig is falling is the type of trailer that you're using. The trailer that you're using will dictate a lot of times how quick your jig falls, because if you're using a big flap and tail trailer like a rage craw or a speed craw, that resistance from the flappers is going to slow your jig down. So you may have a 1/2 ounce jig that falls slower than like a 1/4 ounce or a 3/4 or 3/8 ounce with a different trailer on it. So remember that the jig profile and size and trailer size dictates the fall of that, as well as the line size. The line size has another factor in it too. The heavier the line you're using, the slower your jig is going to fall. So all this factors in, to what you're doing. So I don't want that to sound confusing. I know that's a lot of information to absorb at once, but I sort of want to give that out as the foundation. That'll get you started if you're having some problems getting bit on jigs. But the main thing, guys, is you just have to fish them. You can't go out and fish a jig for 10 minutes and not get bit, and then pick up your shaky head or your Texas rig or your Texas rig craw or your Texas rig creature bait just because you're getting some more bites on it. Very seldom will you be in a situation where they're biting a Texas rig, anything, when they won't bite a jig. You may not get as many bites on it, but your quality will go up. Your quality and the size of your fish when you get bit on a jig is generally one quarter to 1/2 pound larger size fish than on a Texas rig setup. So that's just a few oversights, guys, broad oversights. Like I said, the main thing is just putting them in your hand and fishing them. Jigs, in my opinion, are only second to jerk baits as far as being the most complicated lure category to learn how to fish, because you got so many different variables. But we'll keep pecking away on it. I'm going to do a ton of videos on jig stuff, on subtle details. And again, like I said, if you guys are interested in our jig here, the Block at Old School, Baitworks link in the description. Definitely it'll be a good jig to get you started out with. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll be back soon. Drop some comments if there's something I didn't cover here that you'd like me to cover. And we'll be back with another one soon. See you.